So we've talked about getting air into the lungs. We've talked about the exchange of our gases and how that's affected depending on which place you are. We've talked about our different respiratory volumes. Now we actually look at how we actually transport this stuff around the body and actually have the exchange. So our gas transport, of course, that's taking oxygen from the lungs to the tissues and taking carbon dioxide from the tissues to the lungs. So with our two gases, oxygen, most of it is bound to hemoglobin, so on that heme portion, and then the rest of it is dissolved in the plasma, so the liquid portion of blood. For carbon dioxide, most of it is in carbonic acid, so we're going to get to that equation. Some of it is bound to different proteins, and then some of it is just dissolved as a gas in the plasma. So during exchange, most of your carbon dioxide is going to come from the reverse of that carbonic acid equation. Some of it comes off the proteins, and then some of it's just coming from your dissolved gases. So, oxygen transport on hemoglobin. Oops. Okay, so with our hemoglobin, each of the globin proteins has a heme group that can carry an oxygen molecule. So one hemoglobin, since it has 4 of them, it can carry 4 molecules of oxygen. So when it is bound to an oxygen, it's called oxyhemoglobin. So hemoglobin with oxygen. When there isn't oxygen bound to it, it's called deoxyhemoglobin. So we have hemoglobin. And in this case, when we talk about this later, with that whole carbonic acid equation exchange, basically hydrogen is going to knock off oxygen off its binding spot, and so replaces it. So that's what that H is for. It's for just a hydrogen ion. So looking at our air going from our alveoli through our tissues, of course, you're going to have a drop in how much oxygenated hemoglobin you're going to have. So less percentage of oxygen being on that hemoglobin. So in the tissues, only about 40%. So it's not like a total drop off. So for our carbon dioxide, it has 3 different forms for transport. So carbonic acid, that's the main one. Carbamino compound, so binding to proteins and then just being dissolved as a dissolved gas. So here's our carbonic acid reaction. Surprised I didn't actually put it on there. Okay, whatever. So we have carbon dioxide. It's going to dissolve in water. That's going to form carbonic acid. That carbonic acid is then going to dissociate into bicarbonate and hydrogen ions. And then again, the rest of it on proteins as well, which include our hemoglobin. So that's just what they're showing here is the hemoglobin with carbon dioxide attached to it. So, but again, it attaches to the globin protein portion, so not the heme portion that your oxygen binds to. So again, doesn't compete with oxygen, different parts of its use, so hemoglobin can do both of them at the same time. Rest of it's just dissolved in your blood plasma. So when you actually have exchange, about most of it's coming from the reversal of that carbonic acid reaction, coming off of proteins, and then the rest from the dissolved plasma. So let's look at systemic gas exchange. So we're in the tissues. We're going to get rid of oxygen and pick up carbon dioxide. So we start off with the carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is going to diffuse into the blood from the tissues. We go through this whole carbonic acid reaction, so shifting this way. When carbonic acid ionizes into bicarbonate and the hydrogen ion, the next step is the chloride shift. So we have, and then we're going to use this again for making hydrochloric acid. So chloride, and there's your hydrogen. So you might as well know this equation. Okay, just know the words of it. You don't have to know the actual molecule and structure and that kind of stuff. So you move to chloride shift. So that bicarbonate is going to go out of a red blood cell and chloride comes in. Your hydrogen that dissociated off is going to bind to hemoglobin. So that's going to keep you from having an acidic pH buildup. Plus, it's also going to knock off oxygen from its binding spot. So that helps to unload the oxygen. So when hydrogen binds to the hemoglobin with oxygen attached to it, oxygen gets knocked off its space. Therefore, our oxygen could then go down its concentration gradient into the tissues. So you don't drop off everything. Hemoglobin still has about 75% of the oxygen, like I mentioned earlier. You got about 2 minutes of air before you need another breath. So here is a picture form of that for my picture people. So that's starting off with carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide comes from our tissues. It dissolves across our respiratory membrane. So here's just different ways, so either being dissolved, binding to a protein, or the bigger percent of it going through our carbonic acid reaction. Here's our chloride shift. Here's that hydrogen ion that's going to knock off oxygen off of hemoglobin. So when that happens, we have our deoxygenated hemoglobin, oxygen that can go down its concentration gradient and into the tissues. And the rest of it is just coming from dissolved gas. Okay, so going back to the lungs where we have our alveolar gas exchange. So we've picked up carbon dioxide. So now how do we get it out the blood? So your hemoglobin, so oxygen's going to come in. It's going to load up and knock off hydrogen off of the hemoglobin molecule. So now we got this free hydrogen. So now we can do a opposite of what happened in our tissues. So we have a reverse chloride shift that's going to bring back this bicarbonate ion back into the red blood cell. So this hydrogen that got knocked off of hemoglobin is going to rebind with our bicarbonate, forming carbonic acid again. So we're shifting the reaction into the left direction. Here's our carbonic acid. We again shift to the left and forming back our carbon dioxide and water. This carbon dioxide then can go down its concentration gradient from the blood into the air inside the lungs and be breathed out. Picture for people who like that. Okay, so gas exchange in the alveoli. So in those air sacs, some of it's coming in oxygen as just dissolved gas in the plasma. Most of it's going to bind to hemoglobin. So when oxygen comes in, it knocks off the hydrogen ion off of hemoglobin. We have a reverse chloride shift. So our bicarbonate ion is brought back in. Bicarbonate plus our hydrogen ion is going to make our carbonic acid. This enzyme helps to reverse the equation, send the equations first direction. So our carbonic anhydrase enzyme. So that's going to shift it toward just being carbon dioxide and water. The carbon dioxide goes down its concentration gradient from the blood to our lungs. The rest of it unbinds from a protein, goes into the lungs, and the rest of it is just dissolved gas. Okay, so how our body activity can affect gas exchange. So again, we need that oxygen in order to create ATP. So if we need more ATP, we need some more oxygen. So there's oxygen unloading depending on what you're doing. So there's 4 things that are going to affect that. So our ambient partial pressure of oxygen. So how much oxygen do we have? Temperature can affect that. The Bohr effect will affect that. So down here. And then how much of biphosphoglycerate or BPG do we have? So first one, ambient partial pressure of oxygen. So because, let's say you're exercising or whatever, you are using up more oxygen because you're needing the ATP production. So you have even less partial pressure of oxygen inside that active tissue. So more oxygen is going to be released from hemoglobin when blood comes by to drop off oxygen. Next thing that can affect it is your pH. So as your tissues are making your ATP, part of the byproduct is the production of carbon dioxide. So you're going to have an increase in the level of carbon dioxide in that active tissue. So back with our carbonic acid reaction. So we're shifting that equation to the left because we have all the CO2. So it's going to shift, not shift it to the left, shift it to the right. End up with our carbonic acid, which dissociates into our bicarbonate and hydrogen ions. So that's going to lower the pH of the blood, so make it more acidic. And that's also going to help to increase the oxygen unloading. So basically those hydrogen ions are going to kick even more oxygen off of hemoglobin. That's my man. I'm just kidding. Okay, next thing, levels of biphosphoglycerate or BPG. So your red blood cells produce your BPG, which can also bind to hemoglobin and so therefore kick more oxygen off of hemoglobin. So reason why we would have increased levels of BPG is, let's say you have a fever. You're in increased growth hormone, so of course you're more active there. Testosterone levels, which it also can increase your body activity, and epinephrine, so remembering our fight or flight, our sympathetic nervous system stimulation causes the release of epinephrine, so your tissues are going to be even more active. So that's also going to kick off more oxygen off of hemoglobin so you can use it. Last one is your temperature. So active tissue, just tissue that's doing stuff, is going to have an increase in temperature. Remembering when muscles contract, they, for example, the energy that they use, it's not really that effective or efficient at it, and so you end up losing some of that energy as heat. But that also helps you to maintain your body temperature, whatever. So let's say you have an increase in temperature because you're active for whatever reason. That's also going to increase more oxygen being unloaded off of hemoglobin so that active tissue can have what it needs. Your carbon dioxide exchange is also going to be affected. So this is called the Haldane Effect. So Okay, so for the Haldane Effect, so we are dropping off even more oxygen than normal. But that also means we need to carry off more carbon dioxide because that active tissue is making even more of it. So the increased levels of lower carrying hemoglobin is going to allow us to pick up even more carbon dioxide so we can take it to the lungs and get that crap out of our system because we don't need it. Got too much. We've been being active. Okay. Oops. So with our blood gases and how much is in the blood, so the levels, again, we have kind of normalized levels, and we'll talk about this later when we deal with our acid-base balance stuff. So you'll see this number specifically again. So there are some normal, roughly, areas where we keep our pH, concentration, or partial pressure of carbon dioxide. Same thing with oxygen. So we have chemoreceptors that can detect these levels and help to regulate how much we need to breathe based off the blood chemistry. So stimulus for breathing, first one's pH. That one is going to be affected by those carbon dioxide that we just continue to produce. So how much we need to adjust what goes out, what comes in. First thing is maintaining our body's pH because if not, we don't function. Second thing, getting rid of carbon dioxide, which is also going to affect pH. So if we have too much, we're going to have too acidic of a body, and so we need to get rid of that acid. Or too little, we're not acidic enough, and that's still going to interrupt our body function. And then the last one is oxygen. Remember, again, you got 2 minutes before you can take a next breath. Most people will take another breath before then, so not really a big deal. Okay. So with our normal exchange of gases, whether we retain carbon dioxide, whether we're getting rid of carbon dioxide, we keep our pH in a value in between 7.35 and 7.45. Now, if our blood pH goes lower than 7.35, then we're in acidosis. So basically, we got too much acid in the blood. Our pH is too low. Alkalosis is the exact opposite. So our blood pH has gone higher than 7.45. So later in the exam 9 section, we'll actually do an activity where we're looking at blood values and looking at pH, whether or not you're in acidosis, whether you're in alkalosis, and how different situations in the body can actually cause that. There's also other blood value levels that you look at, like levels of carbon dioxide, which again, going through that carbonic acid acid equation will determine how many of these excess hydrogen atoms that you have to affect your blood pH. Oh, okay. I do actually want to keep this. Okay, so when we do that activity later in the exam 9 section, we'll be looking at partial pressures of, for example, your carbon dioxide, as well as partial pressure carbon dioxide, pH, what's that last thing? And bicarbonate levels to see what we're dealing with. So one way that we can change our body's pH is by changing our breathing rate. So if the problem is that you are not breathing off enough carbon dioxide or not holding on to it enough, you can affect this if your lungs are still working correctly and they're not the problem. You can do this by either hyperventilating or hypoventilating. So hyperventilation is where your body's in acidosis. You got too many hydrogen ions, so we got to blow off that carbon dioxide. So we're pushing this reaction to the left so we can breathe off the carbon dioxide, which reduces our hydrogen levels, so therefore reducing the acid, and raise our blood pH back towards normal. Opposite situation, hypoventilation, so slowing down our breathing rate. So we have not held on to enough carbon dioxide. So by holding on to the carbon dioxide, we're able to shift this reaction towards the right. So increasing our level of hydrogen ions, so the acid, that's going to lower our pH back toward normal levels. So one thing, and you'll see this when they talk about like people who are diabetic, where you are breaking down your fats very rapidly, because diabetics, they have issues with being able to get glucose into the cells, so they start breaking down fats. And if they do too much of this, you end up with ketoacidosis, because part of that breakdown, you're going to create ketone bodies, which are acidic. So could have an increase in respiration to get rid of carbon dioxide and help to balance out the acidity from those ketone bodies. Let's see. Okay, so the rest of this chapter just goes into how different body activities can affect your exchange of gases using your different receptors and different respiratory situations. I think those are the last 3 of these. Yeah. But they're not on the test, so I'm not going to talk about them. So we're done with chapter 22. So this is the end of exam 7 stuff. Send me a message, question on D2L if you need me.